close your eyes and imagine a world where time moves differently than it does today. Picture yourself standing in a quiet European village on a crisp morning in 1347, watching the mist rise from cobblestone streets still wet with dew. The air carries the warm scent of bread baking in stone ovens, while church bells ring softly across rolling hills dotted with sheep. Children's laughter echoes from narrow alleyways, and merchants arrange their wares in the market square, their voices mixing with the gentle clip-clop of horses' hooves. This is a world that feels solid, predictable, eternal. The same families have lived in these villages for generations, following the same rhythms their ancestors knew. The same prayers are whispered in the same stone chapels. The same hands work the same fields, under the same endless sky. But on this peaceful morning, something is stirring in the distant east, something that will change everything forever. Tonight, let us journey together through one of history's most transformative chapters, when the medieval world discovered that even the most solid foundations can shift beneath our feet. In the early decades of the 14th century, Europe hummed with a confidence born of centuries of gradual growth and stability. The terrible uncertainties of the Dark Ages had faded into memory, replaced by a world that seemed to have found its rhythm. Villages had grown into towns, towns into cities, and cities into centers of learning and trade that stretched their influence across continents. Imagine walking through the streets of Paris on a market day in 1340, 7 years before everything changed. The air would be thick with the mingled scents of roasting meat, fresh bread, and the exotic spices that merchants brought from distant lands. Tapestries hung from upper windows, their rich colors catching the morning light, while below, cobblestones worn smooth by countless footsteps created a patchwork of greys and browns that seemed to pulse with life. The sounds of this world created their own symphony. The steady rhythm of hammers on anvils rang out from the blacksmith's quarter, punctuated by the calls of vendors selling everything from fresh fish to hand. Church bells marked the hours with their bronze voices, while the wooden wheels of carts created a constant, comforting rumble as they carried goods and people through streets that had been walked by generations of families. This was a world where social order felt as permanent as the stone cathedrals that dominated every skyline. Peasants worked the fields as their fathers had, and their fathers before them. Nobles lived in castles that had stood for centuries, their towers reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest in stone. Merchants followed trade routes that had been established for generations, their caravans moving along paths worn deep by countless journeys. In the workshops of craftsmen, skills passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain that stretched back through time. The carpenter who shaped a chair had learned his trade from a master, who had learned it from his master, back through decades of accumulated wisdom. The weaver who worked her loom followed patterns that had been perfected over centuries, her fingers moving in rhythms that connected her to countless women who had worked these same motions before her. The great universities of Europe, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, had become centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the known world. In their lecture halls, men debated questions of philosophy and theology with the passionate intensity of those who believed that human reason could unlock the deepest mysteries of existence. The works of Aristotle and Aquinas provided frameworks for understanding everything from the movement of the stars to the nature of the human soul. Yet beneath this confidence, subtle vulnerabilities were building like fault lines in the earth. The population of Europe had grown steadily for 3 centuries, pressing against the limits of what medieval agriculture could sustain. Cities had become dense warrens of narrow streets and overcrowded buildings, where waste and fresh water competed for the same channels. The very trade networks that brought prosperity also created pathways that connected every corner of the known world. The medical knowledge of the time, though advanced by medieval standards, remained limited by what we now understand about disease and contagion. Physicians trained in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates could treat many ailments with herbs and careful observation, but they worked within a framework that attributed illness to imbalances of bodily humors rather than invisible organisms that could travel from person to person. In the countryside, families lived in close quarters with their animals, sharing warmth and space in ways that created intimate bonds between human and animal worlds. Grain stores and root cellars were often home to mice and rats, creatures so common that they were simply accepted as part of the natural order. Ships carried not just cargo and passengers, but entire ecosystems of rats, fleas, and other small travelers that moved invisibly through the networks of medieval commerce. The spiritual life of medieval Europe provided both comfort and structure to daily existence. The church was not merely a religious institution, but the organizing principle of society itself. Its calendar marked the rhythm of the year, its festivals provided breaks from labor, and its teachings offered explanations for everything, from the changing seasons to the mysteries of birth and death. In every village, the church building was often the largest and most beautiful structure, its spire reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing to the eternal. This was a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, where the faces in the market were familiar faces, where the stories told by the fire at night were stories that had been told for generations. It was a world that felt solid, predictable, and eternal. As we drift back through time to observe this vanished world, we can almost feel the weight of its certainties, the comfort of its familiar rhythms. These were our ancestors, people who shared our hopes and fears, our capacity for joy and sorrow, our deep need for connection and meaning. They built their lives on foundations that had served their ancestors well, never imagining that the very networks that brought them prosperity would soon carry destruction beyond their wildest nightmares. But even as merchants arranged their goods in market squares and scholars debated in university halls, something was stirring in the distant east. Along the ancient trade routes that connected Europe to Asia, travelers were beginning to carry disturbing stories. Whispers of cities falling silent, of caravans that never reached their destinations, of a darkness spreading across the lands beyond the horizon. To understand how the plague reached Europe, we must follow the ancient pathways that connected the medieval world. Those ribbons of commerce and culture that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, binding together civilizations that had never seen each other's faces, but shared each other's goods, ideas, and, ultimately, each other's fates. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of routes that wound through some of the world's most challenging terrain. Picture caravans of camels and horses making their way across the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, their bells chiming softly in the thin air as they carried precious cargo between worlds. These were paths that had been walked for centuries, routes so well established that they seemed as permanent as rivers, connecting the great cities of China to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. In the 1330s, as Europe basked in its medieval confidence, something began to disturb the rhythms of these ancient trade routes. At first, it was nothing more than whispers. Stories passed from merchant to merchant around campfires under the brilliant stars of the Asian steppes. Travelers spoke of cities in China and Central Asia where the markets had grown strangely quiet, where the usual bustle of commerce had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Imagine yourself as a merchant in one of these caravans, your camels laden with silk and spices, your purse heavy with the promise of profit in distant European markets. As you rest at a trading post somewhere in the vast expanses between worlds, you hear disturbing tales from fellow travelers. They speak of entire communities that have simply vanished, of trading posts where no one comes to the door, of paths that have grown quiet for reasons no one can explain. The plague that would become known as the Black Death had actually begun its journey years earlier, in the 1330s, somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia. Modern science tells us that it was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats and other rodents. But to the people of the time, it was simply a mysterious force that seemed to drain the life from entire regions, leaving behind only silence and empty buildings. The disease moved along the trade routes like a shadow, following the same paths that had carried goods and culture for centuries. It traveled with the caravans, hiding in their grain stores and cargo holds, spreading from settlement to settlement with the inexorable patience of something that had all the time in the world. The very networks that had brought prosperity to medieval civilization were now carrying its greatest challenge. As the plague moved westward, the stories grew more detailed and more disturbing. Merchants who had traded with partners in distant cities found their contacts mysteriously silent. Caravans that had always arrived on schedule simply failed to appear. The great trading city of Samarkand, jewel of the Silk Road, grew strangely quiet. The bustling bazaars of Baghdad saw fewer and fewer merchants arriving from the east. But still, the full scope of what was happening remained hidden. The medieval world was vast, communication was slow, and disasters in distant lands often seemed as remote as stories from another world. European merchants continued to plan their expeditions. Chinese craftsmen continued to produce their goods, and the great machinery of medieval commerce continued to turn, even as something unprecedented moved through its very heart. The plague's journey westward accelerated as it reached the more densely populated regions of the Middle East. Here, the disease found ideal conditions for its spread crowded cities, busy ports, and extensive trade networks that connected every corner of the known world. The great cities of the Islamic world, centers of learning and commerce that had flourished for centuries, became unwitting staging grounds for Europe's approaching catastrophe. By the early 1340s, the plague had reached the shores of the Black Sea, that inland sea that served as a crucial bridge between the Asian and European worlds. Here, in the bustling trading posts that lined its shores, merchants from Italy, Byzantium, and the Eastern Mediterranean regularly gathered to exchange goods and news. It was here that the disease would make its fateful leap from the Asian to the European world. The Genoese trading post of Caffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula, had served for generations as a vital link in the chain of commerce that connected East and West. Its warehouses were filled with goods from across the known world, silks from China, spices from India, precious stones from Persia. Its inhabitants included merchants from every major trading city in Europe, men who had come to seek their fortunes in the lucrative trade with the East. It was to Caffa that the plague came in 1346, carried by merchants and travelers who had no idea they were transporting something far more dangerous than any cargo they had ever handled. The city that had prospered for centuries by connecting different worlds was about to become the bridge that would carry medieval Europe's greatest challenge across the threshold of the continent. In the markets of Caffa, as autumn turned to winter in 1340s, astute observers might have noticed subtle changes in the rhythms of trade. Certain familiar faces failed to appear at their usual stalls. Ships that had been expected from eastern ports simply never arrived. The usual flow of news and gossip from the Asian trade routes had grown strangely sporadic, but life continued with its familiar patterns. European merchants continued to load their ships with eastern goods, preparing for the journey back to Genoa, Venice, and other ports that had grown wealthy on the profits of eastern trade. Chinese and Central Asian traders continued to arrange their wares in the covered markets, their voices mixing with the dozen languages that created the cosmopolitan atmosphere of this crucial trading post. None of them knew that they were living through the final months of a world that had endured for centuries. None of them could have imagined that the familiar rhythms of their commercial life were about to be shattered by something that would make the wars and famines of the past seem like minor inconveniences. As winter settled over the shores of the Black Sea, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic transformations. The plague had completed its long journey from the steppes of Asia, traveling along routes that had been walked for centuries by countless feet, carried by countless hands, witnessed by countless eyes. Now it stood poised to cross the final threshold into the European world, ready to test everything that medieval civilization had built. The merchants of Caffa continued their preparations for the spring trading season, unaware that they were about to become participants in a drama that would reshape the course of human history. In their warehouses and counting houses, in their homes and families, in their hopes and plans for the future, they carried all the confidence of a civilization that had learned to see itself as solid, predictable, and eternal. But change was coming with a swiftness that would leave no time for preparation, no opportunity for gradual adaptation. The medieval world was about to discover that even the most established patterns of life could be transformed overnight, that even the most solid foundations could prove to be built on shifting sand. The story of how the plague first entered European consciousness reads like a dark fairy tale, complete with siege warfare, desperate defenders, and an enemy that proved far more deadly than any human army. In the winter of 1346, the Genoese trading post of Caffa found itself surrounded by Mongol forces under the command of Janibeg Khan, who had come to claim this profitable outpost for his own expanding territory. Picture the scene as winter gave way to spring in 1347. The city of Caffa, with its strong walls and well-stocked warehouses, had withstood sieges before. Its defenders, a mixture of Genoese merchants and local allies, had every reason to believe they could outlast this latest threat. The harbour remained open to the sea, allowing supplies and reinforcements to arrive by ship, while the city's walls had been built to withstand the most sophisticated siege engines of the medieval world. The Mongol besiegers, experienced warriors who had conquered cities across Asia, settled in for what they expected to be a prolonged campaign. Their camps spread across the hills surrounding Caffa, their horses grazing on the spring grass, while their commanders planned the systematic reduction of the city's defenses. This was warfare as it had been practiced for centuries, a test of endurance, engineering, and will between besiegers and defenders. But something was wrong in the Mongol camps. As the siege progressed through the spring of 1347, astute observers on the city walls might have noticed disturbing changes in the patterns of their enemies' activity. Burial parties became more frequent, the usual sounds of a military camp, the ring of hammers on metal, the calls of officers directing their men, the general bustle of organized activity grew strangely muted. The plague had arrived among the besiegers, carried by the same trade routes that had brought prosperity to Caffa. The Mongol warriors, hardened veterans of countless campaigns, found themselves facing an enemy they could not fight with swords or arrows. Men who had never shown fear in battle began to fall ill with strange symptoms, fever, weakness, and the dark swellings that would give the plague its European name. As the disease spread through the besieging army, Janibeg Khan faced a terrible decision. His forces were melting away, not through military defeat, but through an invisible enemy that seemed to strike at random. The siege that had begun with such confidence was turning into a nightmare of helplessness and fear. It was then that one of history's most fateful decisions was made. According to the accounts of witnesses, Janibeg Khan ordered his men to load the bodies of plague victims into their siege catapults and hurl them over the walls of Caffa. Whether this was a deliberate act of biological warfare or simply a desperate gesture of spite, the consequences would reshape the course of human history. The corpses that sailed through the air above Caffa's walls carried with them more than death. The defenders, horrified by this unprecedented form of warfare, did their best to dispose of the bodies, But the damage was already done. The plague had found its way inside the city's walls, and no amount of military skill could defend against this particular enemy. Within days, the same symptoms that had devastated the Mongol army began to appear among the defenders of Caffa. The strong young men who had manned the walls grew weak and feverish. The merchants who had confidently planned their next trading ventures found themselves unable to rise from their beds. The families who had sheltered behind the city's walls discovered that stone and mortar provided no protection against this invisible invader. As the plague spread through Caffa, panic began to replace the disciplined resistance that had characterized the siege. The careful organization of the defense collapsed as officers fell ill and the chain of command broke down. The warehouses, full of valuable goods, stood largely abandoned as their owners fled or succumbed to the disease. The harbor, once busy with supply ships and reinforcements, saw a different kind of traffic as survivors desperately sought passage to anywhere that might offer safety. It was in this atmosphere of panic and desperation that the fateful decision was made. A group of Genoese merchants, survivors of the plague that had devastated their trading post, loaded their remaining goods onto ships and prepared to return to Europe. They had no way of knowing that they were carrying something far more dangerous than any cargo they had ever transported. The ships that departed Caffa in the late spring of 1347 carried with them not just the survivors of the siege, but the rats and fleas that had traveled with them throughout their long residence in the city. These small, invisible passengers had become the vectors for a disease that would soon spread throughout the entire European continent. As the ships sailed westward across the Black Sea, their crews and passengers had no idea that they were about to become harbingers of one of history's greatest transformations. They were simply merchants trying to return home, survivors of a siege that had ended not in military victory or defeat, but in the strange dissolution of both armies before an enemy that neither side could fight. The medieval world's first encounter with biological warfare had ended not with the triumph of one side over another, but with the victory of a force that recognized no human boundaries or allegiances. The plague that had traveled thousands of miles along the ancient trade routes had finally found its way to the threshold of Europe, carried by the very merchants who had profited from the connections between East and West. Behind them, the city of Caffa gradually fell silent. The siege that had begun with such military precision had dissolved into chaos as both besiegers and defenders fled or succumbed to the plague. The warehouses full of valuable goods stood empty, their contents scattered or abandoned. The strong walls that had withstood military assault proved useless against an enemy that required no siege engines or scaling ladders. The Mongol army, decimated by disease, eventually withdrew from the region, leaving behind a landscape marked by empty camps and hastily dug graves. The great trading post that had connected Europe to Asia for generations had become a monument to the futility of human plans in the face of forces beyond human control. But the real story was just beginning. The ships that had departed Caffa were now sailing toward the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, carrying with them the seeds of a transformation that would reshape European civilization. The medieval world was about to discover that its greatest challenges could arrive not through the clash of armies or the rise and fall of kingdoms, but through the invisible passengers that traveled with ordinary merchants on ordinary ships. In October of 1347, as the first autumn winds began to stir the waters of the Mediterranean, the harbour of Messina in Sicily presented its usual picture of bustling commercial activity. Merchants arranged their goods along the waterfront, sailors prepared their ships for the final trading voyages before winter, and the city's inhabitants went about their daily business with the comfortable confidence of people whose lives followed familiar, predictable patterns. It was into this scene of normalcy that the plague ships arrived, their dark hulls cutting through the bright blue waters of the Mediterranean like harbingers of a different world. The vessels that approached the harbour that October morning appeared normal enough from a distance. Genoese trading ships of the type that had visited Messina countless times before, their holds presumably filled with the exotic goods that had made the Mediterranean a highway of prosperity for centuries. But as the ships drew closer to the harbour, astute observers might have noticed something unsettling about their appearance. They moved sluggishly through the water, as if their crews were having difficulty managing the sails and rigging. There was none of the usual bustle of activity on deck that characterized merchant vessels approaching a profitable port. Instead, an eerie quiet seemed to surround the ships, broken only by the sound of wind in their rigging and the gentle splash of waves against their hulls. The harbour officials who rowed out to meet the ships made a discovery that would haunt the collective memory of Europe for generations. The crews of these vessels were either dead or dying, their bodies sprawled across the decks like broken dolls. Those few sailors who still clung to life were barely able to speak, their skin burning with fever and marked by the dark swellings that would give the plague its name. Picture the scene as these officials climbed aboard the ships, their torches casting dancing shadows across a tableau of death. The holds that should have been filled with valuable cargo contained instead the bodies of men who had died during the voyage, their faces twisted by suffering and their skin blackened by disease. The few survivors who remained conscious spoke in whispers of a terrible sickness that had struck without warning, taking the strong as easily as the weak. The immediate response of the Messina authorities was both understandable and tragically inadequate. Recognizing that something unprecedented had arrived in their harbour, they ordered the ships to be driven away from the port. But the damage was already done. The rats and fleas that had travelled with the ships had already begun to make their way onto the docks, carrying with them the invisible agents of European civilization's greatest challenge. Word of the plague ships spread quickly through the close-knit community of Mediterranean merchants. Similar vessels were soon appearing at ports across the region: Genoa, Venice, Marseille, each carrying the same cargo of death and disease. The captains who had survived the journey told remarkably similar stories of crews that had sickened and died with terrifying speed, of cargo holds that had become floating morgues, of a disease that seemed to strike at random without regard for age, strength, or station. The response of medieval authorities to this unprecedented crisis reveals both the limitations of their medical knowledge and the fundamental humanity of their reaction to inexplicable suffering. In port after port, officials attempted to quarantine the plague ships, to prevent their crews from coming ashore, to somehow contain a threat they couldn't understand. But the disease had already begun its work, spreading through the rat populations that infested every medieval city, carried by fleas that recognized no human boundaries or regulations. In Messina, the first European city to experience the full force of the plague, the disease spread with a speed that shocked even those who had heard the stories brought by the ships. Within days of the vessel's arrival, the first cases began to appear among the dock workers and merchants who had been closest to the contaminated cargo. The symptoms were unlike anything in the experience of medieval medicine. Sudden fever, weakness, and the appearance of dark, painful swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck. The city's physicians, trained in the classical traditions of Galen and Hippocrates, found themselves completely unprepared for this new challenge. Their treatments, based on balancing the body's humours and purging harmful substances, proved utterly ineffective against a disease that seemed to operate by entirely different rules. The careful observations and logical deductions that had served medieval medicine for centuries suddenly seemed as useless as trying to fight fire with scrolls of parchment. As the plague spread through Messina, the normal rhythms of daily life began to break down. The markets that had bustled with activity grew quiet as merchants fell ill or fled the city. The workshops where craftsmen had practiced their trades for generations stood empty, their tools gathering dust while their owners lay dying in their beds. The churches that had provided spiritual comfort for centuries found themselves overwhelmed by requests for last rites and funeral services. The social fabric of the community, woven over generations of shared experience and mutual dependence, began to unravel under the pressure of unprecedented mortality. Families that had lived in the same neighborhoods for centuries found themselves isolated by fear and suspicion. The bonds of friendship and obligation that had held the community together proved fragile in the face of a threat that seemed to strike without pattern or reason. Yet even in the midst of this breakdown, individual stories of courage and compassion emerged. Physicians who knew their treatments were useless continued to tend the sick, offering what comfort they could in the face of certain death. Priests continued to perform last rites, even as they watched their parishioners die by the dozens. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing food and water and providing care for orphaned children, even as they risked their own lives in the process. The plague that had arrived in Messina did not remain confined to Sicily. The same trade networks that had brought prosperity to the Mediterranean world now carried disease with ruthless efficiency. Ships departing from infected ports carried the plague to new destinations, spreading the contagion across the entire region with a speed that made any coordinated response impossible. By the end of 1347, the plague had established footholds in ports across the Mediterranean. The great trading cities that had grown wealthy on the profits of international commerce found themselves transformed into staging grounds for Europe's greatest challenge. The very networks that had connected the medieval world, that had allowed goods and ideas to flow freely between distant lands, now carried death with the same efficiency they had once carried silk and spices. The medieval world's first encounter with pandemic, the year 1348, dawned across Europe with the usual rhythms of hope and renewal that had marked the beginning of countless years before. In villages and towns from England to Italy, from France to the German states, people made their plans for the coming year with the confidence of those who had inherited a world that seemed solid and predictable. The harvest of 1347 had been adequate, the political situation was stable, and the great machinery of medieval civilization continued to turn with the steady rhythm of centuries. But beneath this surface of normalcy, something unprecedented was beginning to stir. The plague that had established itself in the Mediterranean ports was preparing to embark on the next phase of its journey, following the rivers and roads that connected the coast to the interior, spreading through the networks of commerce and communication that had taken centuries to build. The disease moved with a logic that was both inexorable and incomprehensible to those who witnessed its progress. It followed the ancient Roman roads that still formed the backbone of European transportation, traveling with merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and scholars, all the ordinary people whose daily journeys had once seemed so routine and safe. It moved along the great rivers, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Thames, that served as highways for goods and people, spreading from port to port with the efficiency of a well-organized military campaign. In the great trading city of Genoa, the plague's arrival in early 1348 transformed a bustling commercial center into a scene from a nightmare. The narrow streets that had once echoed with the calls of merchants and the clatter of carts fell silent, except for the sound of funeral processions and the prayers of the dying. The magnificent palaces of the merchant princes, built to display the wealth that had flowed from Eastern trade, became hospitals and morgues as entire families succumbed to the disease. The response of the Genoese authorities reveals both the limitations of medieval medicine and the fundamental humanity of people faced with an unprecedented crisis. They tried everything their knowledge and experience suggested: quarantine measures, public prayers, the burning of aromatic herbs to purify the air. They expelled Jews and other minorities, seeking scapegoats for a disaster that seemed to defy all human understanding. They imposed strict regulations on movement and trade, desperately trying to contain a threat that had already spread beyond any hope of control. But perhaps most remarkably, they also showed extraordinary compassion and courage. Physicians continued to treat patients even when they knew their efforts were futile. Wealthy merchants opened their warehouses to distribute food to the starving families of plague victims. Religious communities organized relief efforts, providing care for orphans and comfort for the dying, even as their own members fell victim to the disease. The plague's journey northward into France followed the valley of the Rhône, that ancient pathway that had carried Roman legions and medieval pilgrims between the Mediterranean and the heart of Europe. As the disease spread through the prosperous towns and cities of southern France, it encountered a civilization that had reached unprecedented heights of cultural and economic achievement. In Avignon, the seat of the papal court and one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe, the plague's arrival in the spring of 1348 created a crisis that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval Christianity. Here was a city that housed the successor of St. Peter, surrounded by the greatest scholars and theologians of the age, protected by the prayers of countless monks and nuns. Yet the plague struck with the same ruthless efficiency it had shown in the commercial ports of Italy. Pope Clement VI, watching his city succumb to the disease, made decisions that would echo through centuries of church history. He declared that those who died of the plague would be granted automatic absolution, recognizing that the normal sacraments of the church were inadequate to deal with mass mortality on this scale. He ordered the construction of a new cemetery when the existing burial grounds became overwhelmed. Most significantly, he issued a papal bull protecting Jews from persecution, recognizing that scapegoating would only add human cruelty to natural disaster. The plague's arrival in Paris in the summer of 1348 struck at the intellectual heart of medieval Europe. The University of Paris, which had attracted scholars from across the continent, found its lecture halls empty and its libraries abandoned as students and masters fled or succumbed to the disease. The great debates that had once filled the schools with passionate argument, questions about the nature of God, the structure of the universe, the proper relationship between faith and reason, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of mass death. Yet even in the midst of this intellectual collapse, some scholars continued their work, trying to understand the plague within the framework of medieval knowledge. They wrote treatises on the disease's causes, blaming everything from corrupted air to unfavorable alignments of the planets. They proposed treatments based on classical medical theory, recommending bloodletting, purging, and the use of various herbs and minerals. Their efforts were largely futile, but they represented humanity's refusal to surrender to incomprehensible forces without a fight. The plague's journey across the English Channel in the autumn of 1348 marked its arrival in a land that had seemed protected by the natural barriers of geography. England, with its strong monarchy and well-developed legal system, its prosperous wool trade and growing towns, had good reason to feel confident about its ability to handle any challenge. But the disease that arrived in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset showed no respect for English exceptionalism or natural barriers. The spread of the plague through England revealed the interconnected nature of medieval society in ways that would have been impossible to imagine in normal times. The disease moved from the ports to the market towns, from the market towns to the villages, following the networks of trade and communication that connected every corner of the kingdom. The wool merchants who had made England prosperous became unwitting agents of destruction, carrying the plague from infected ports to the rural communities that supplied their trade. In the countryside, the plague struck at the heart of agricultural society. The manor houses that had been centers of rural life for centuries found themselves without tenants, as entire villages succumbed to the disease. The carefully maintained fields that had fed England for generations grew wild as there was no one left to tend them. The great forests that had been cleared over centuries began to reclaim abandoned farmland, erasing in months the work of generations. The religious communities that had provided spiritual guidance and practical assistance to medieval society found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Monasteries that had maintained schools and hospitals for centuries watched their members die by the dozens. The careful preservation of knowledge that had been the life's work of countless scribes and scholars seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of immediate survival. Yet, even in the midst of this collapse, new forms of human organization began to emerge. Communities that had lost their traditional leaders found new ways to govern themselves. Families that had been separated by death formed new bonds with neighbors and strangers. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval society began to blur as survival became more important than status. The plague's arrival in the German states revealed the fragmentary nature of political authority in Central Europe. Unlike the unified kingdoms of France and England, the German territories were divided among dozens of princes, bishops, and free cities, each with their own laws and customs. This political fragmentation made any coordinated response to the plague impossible, but it also created opportunities for local innovation and adaptation. In the great trading cities of the Hanseatic League, the plague struck at the heart of the commercial networks that had connected Northern Europe to the broader medieval world. The merchants who had built their fortunes on the exchange of goods between distant lands found themselves trapped in cities that had become islands of disease and death. The careful regulations that had governed trade for centuries proved useless against a threat that moved with goods and people but could not be detected until it was too late. The psychological impact of the plague on medieval society was perhaps even more profound than its immediate physical effects. This was a civilization that had built its understanding of the world on the assumption that God rewarded virtue and punished vice, that human suffering had meaning and purpose, that the natural order was fundamentally just and comprehensible. The plague challenged all of these assumptions, striking down the virtuous and the wicked with equal efficiency, creating suffering that seemed to serve no purpose and follow no pattern. As 1048 drew to a close, the plague had established itself across most of Europe, transforming a continent that had seemed secure and predictable into a landscape of uncertainty and fear. The medieval world was discovering that even the most solid foundations could shift beneath their feet, that even the most carefully constructed social systems could collapse when faced with challenges they had never been designed to handle. But this was still only the beginning. The plague that had swept across Europe in 1348 was preparing for the next phase of its transformation of medieval society. The immediate crisis of mass mortality would give way to longer-term changes that would reshape European civilization in ways that would echo through centuries. The medieval world was about to discover that surviving a catastrophe was only the first step in a process of change that would touch every aspect of human life. The year 1349 would bring new challenges and new adaptations as the survivors of the plague's first assault began the long process of rebuilding their world. But the Europe that emerged from this reconstruction would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered 1348 with such confidence. The Great Mortality had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The year 1348 dawned across Europe with the usual rhythms of hope and renewal that had marked the beginning of countless years before. In villages and towns from England to Italy, from France to the German states, people made their plans for the coming year with the confidence of those who had inherited a world that seemed solid and predictable. The harvest of 1347 had been adequate, the political situation was stable, and the great machinery of medieval civilization continued to turn with the steady rhythm of centuries. But beneath this surface of normalcy, something unprecedented was beginning to stir. The plague that had established itself in the Mediterranean ports was preparing to embark on the next phase of its journey, following the rivers and roads that connected the coast to the interior. spreading through the networks of commerce and communication that had taken centuries to build. The disease moved with a logic that was both inexorable and incomprehensible to those who witnessed its progress. It followed the ancient Roman roads that still formed the backbone of European transportation, traveling with merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and scholars, all the ordinary people whose daily journeys had once seemed so routine and safe. It moved along the great rivers, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Thames, that served as highways for goods and people, spreading from port to port with the efficiency of a well-organized military campaign. In the great trading city of Genoa, the plague's arrival in early 1348 transformed a bustling commercial centre into a scene from a nightmare. The narrow streets that had once echoed with the calls of merchants and the clatter of carts fell silent, except for the sound of funeral processions and the prayers of the dying. The magnificent palaces of the merchant princes, built to display the wealth that had flowed from Eastern trade, became hospitals and morgues as entire families succumbed to the disease. The response of the Genoese authorities reveals both the limitations of medieval medicine and the fundamental humanity of people faced with an unprecedented crisis. They tried everything their knowledge and experience suggested: quarantine measures, public prayers, the burning of aromatic herbs to purify the air. They expelled Jews and other minorities, seeking scapegoats for a disaster that seemed to defy all human understanding. They imposed strict regulations on movement and trade, desperately trying to contain a threat that had already spread beyond any hope of control. But perhaps most remarkably, they also showed extraordinary compassion and courage. Physicians continued to treat patients even when they knew their efforts were futile. Wealthy merchants opened their warehouses to distribute food to the starving families of plague victims. Religious communities organized relief efforts, providing care for orphans and comfort for the dying, even as their own members fell victim to the disease. The plague's journey northward into France followed the valley of the Rhone, that ancient pathway that had carried Roman legions and medieval pilgrims between the Mediterranean and the heart of Europe. As the disease spread through the prosperous towns and cities of southern France, it encountered a civilization that had reached unprecedented heights of cultural and economic achievement. In Avignon, the seat of the papal court and one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe, the plague's arrival in the spring of 1348 created a crisis that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval Christianity. Here was a city that housed the successor of St. Peter, surrounded by the greatest scholars and theologians of the age, protected by the prayers of countless monks and nuns. Yet the plague struck with the same ruthless efficiency it had shown in the commercial ports of Italy. Pope Clement VI, watching his city succumb to the disease, made decisions that would echo through centuries of church history. He declared that those who died of the plague would be granted automatic absolution, recognizing that the normal sacraments of the church were inadequate to deal with mass mortality on this scale. He ordered the construction of a new cemetery when the existing burial grounds became overwhelmed. Most significantly, he issued a papal bull protecting Jews from persecution, recognizing that scapegoating would only add human cruelty to natural disaster. The plague's arrival in Paris in the summer of 1348 struck at the intellectual heart of medieval Europe. The University of Paris, which had attracted scholars from across the continent, found its lecture halls empty and its libraries abandoned as students and masters fled or succumbed to the disease. The great debates that had once filled the schools with passionate argument, questions about the nature of God, the structure of the universe, the proper relationship between faith and reason, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of mass death. Yet even in the midst of this intellectual collapse, some scholars continued their work, trying to understand the plague within the framework of medieval knowledge. They wrote treatises on the disease's causes, blaming everything from corrupted air to unfavorable alignments of the planets. They proposed treatments based on classical medical theory, recommending bloodletting, purging, and the use of various herbs and minerals. Their efforts were largely futile, but they represented humanity's refusal to surrender to incomprehensible forces without a fight. The plague's journey across the English Channel in the autumn of 1348 marked its arrival in a land that had seemed protected by the natural barriers of geography. England, with its strong monarchy and well-developed legal system, its prosperous wool trade and growing towns, had good reason to feel confident about its ability to handle any challenge. But the disease that arrived in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset showed no respect for English exceptionalism or natural barriers. The spread of the plague through England revealed the interconnected nature of medieval society in ways that would have been impossible to imagine in normal times. The disease moved from the ports to the market towns, from the market towns to the villages, following the networks of trade and communication that connected every corner of the kingdom. The wool merchants who had made England prosperous became unwitting agents of destruction, carrying the plague from infected ports to the rural communities that supplied their trade. In the countryside, the plague struck at the heart of agricultural society. The manor houses that had been centers of rural life for centuries found themselves without tenants, as entire villages succumbed to the disease. The carefully maintained fields that had fed England for generations grew wild as there was no one left to tend them. The great forests that had been cleared over centuries began to reclaim abandoned farmland, erasing in months the work of generations. The religious communities that had provided spiritual guidance and practical assistance to medieval society found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Monasteries that had maintained schools and hospitals for centuries watched their members die by the dozens. The careful preservation of knowledge that had been the life's work of countless scribes and scholars seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of immediate survival. Yet, even in the midst of this collapse, new forms of human organization began to emerge. Communities that had lost their traditional leaders found new ways to govern themselves. Families that had been separated by death formed new bonds with neighbors and strangers. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval society began to blur as survival became more important than status. The plague's arrival in the German states revealed the fragmentary nature of political authority in Central Europe. Unlike the unified kingdoms of France and England, the German territories were divided among dozens of princes, bishops, and free cities, each with their own laws and customs. This political fragmentation made any coordinated response to the plague impossible, but it also created opportunities for local innovation and adaptation. In the great trading cities of the Hanseatic League, the plague struck at the heart of the commercial networks that had connected Northern Europe to the broader medieval world. The merchants who had built their fortunes on the exchange of goods between distant lands found themselves trapped in cities that had become islands of disease and death. The careful regulations that had governed trade for centuries proved useless against a threat that moved with goods and people but could not be detected until it was too late. The psychological impact of the plague on medieval society was perhaps even more profound than its immediate physical effects. This was a civilization that had built its understanding of the world on the assumption that God rewarded virtue and punished vice, that human suffering had meaning and purpose, that the natural order was fundamentally just and comprehensible. The plague challenged all of these assumptions, striking down the virtuous and the wicked with equal efficiency, creating suffering that seemed to serve no purpose and follow no pattern. As 1048 drew to a close, the plague had established itself across most of Europe, transforming a continent that had seemed secure and predictable into a landscape of uncertainty and fear. The medieval world was discovering that even the most solid foundations could shift beneath their feet, that even the most carefully constructed social systems could collapse when faced with challenges they had never been designed to handle. But this was still only the beginning. The plague that had swept across Europe in 1348 was preparing for the next phase of its transformation of medieval society. The immediate crisis of mass mortality would give way to longer-term changes that would reshape European civilization in ways that would echo through centuries. The medieval world was about to discover that surviving a catastrophe was only the first step in a process of change that would touch every aspect of human life. The year 1349 would bring new challenges and new adaptations as the survivors of the plague's first assault began the long process of rebuilding their world. But the Europe that emerged from this reconstruction would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered 1348 with such confidence. The Great Mortality had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. By the spring of 1349, Europe had become a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The familiar rhythms of daily life that had persisted for centuries had been replaced by something entirely new, a world where the normal rules no longer applied, where the most basic assumptions about community, family, and survival had been tested and found wanting. Walk through any town or village in plague-stricken Europe, and you would encounter scenes that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The market squares that had once bustled with merchants and customers now stood largely empty, their cobblestones green with moss and weeds that had begun to grow in the spaces between the stones. The workshops that had echoed with the sounds of hammers and looms now stood silent, their doors hanging open to reveal abandoned tools and half-finished projects that would never be completed. The very air seemed different in these plague-touched communities. Gone was the constant background hum of human activity, the conversations of neighbors, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants advertising their wares. Instead, there was an eerie quiet broken only by the tolling of church bells, the creak of shutters moving in the wind, and the occasional sound of a funeral procession making its way through streets that had once been filled with life. But perhaps most striking of all was the smell. Medieval towns had never been particularly fragrant places, but the plague had brought new odors that spoke of fundamental changes in the patterns of human habitation. The sweet scent of flowers growing wild in abandoned gardens mingled with the acrid smell of lime that had been scattered over mass graves. The familiar aromas of cooking food and wood smoke had been replaced by the medicinal scents of herbs burned to purify the air and the underlying mustiness of buildings that had been sealed and abandoned. Yet, even in the midst of this transformation, life continued. The human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to survive and even thrive in the most challenging circumstances, began to assert itself in countless small ways. In villages where half the population had died, the survivors found new ways to organize their communities. Traditional hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as the stones of the church began to blur and shift as necessity trumped custom. Picture a small English village in the summer of 1349, where the manor house stands empty because its lord has died without heir, and the peasants who once worked his fields must now decide among themselves how to allocate the land and organize the harvest. The careful legal distinctions that had defined medieval society for centuries suddenly seem less important than the practical question of who has the strength and knowledge to keep the community alive. In these transformed communities, women often found themselves taking on roles that had been forbidden to them in the old world. The widow who had once been expected to retire to a convent or remarry quickly might now find herself managing a business, overseeing agricultural operations, or even serving as a community leader. The plague had created a world where competence mattered more than gender, where the ability to organize and lead was more valuable than adherence to traditional roles. Children, too, found their lives transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Orphaned by the disease, They often banded together in informal family groups, learning to survive through cooperation and mutual support. The careful apprenticeship systems that had once governed the transmission of skills from one generation to the next broke down, replaced by more informal arrangements where knowledge was shared out of necessity rather than tradition. The plague had also created new forms of mobility that challenged the settled patterns of medieval life. The concept of being bound to the land, which had been fundamental to feudal society, began to break down as survivors moved freely between communities, seeking better opportunities or simply following their friends and family members. The roads that had once carried merchants and pilgrims now carried a new kind of traveler plague survivors, seeking new homes and new lives in a world that had been emptied of its previous inhabitants. In the cities, the transformation was even more dramatic. The great urban centers that had been the crown jewels of medieval civilization found themselves struggling to maintain the basic functions of civilized life. The complex systems of water supply, waste disposal, and food distribution that had supported dense populations required constant maintenance and organization. When the plague killed the officials and craftsmen who had managed these systems, the cities faced the choice between adaptation and collapse. Venice, that marvel of medieval engineering and commerce, found itself grappling with the practical challenges of maintaining its elaborate system of canals and bridges with a decimated workforce. The gondoliers who had once carried passengers and goods through the city's waterways now found themselves pressed into service as undertakers, ferrying the dead to the plague islands where mass graves awaited. The magnificent palaces that had housed the merchant princes stood empty, their treasures locked away while their owners lay buried in hasty graves. Yet even Venice, perhaps because of its long experience with international trade and its exposure to diverse cultures, showed remarkable resilience in the face of catastrophe. The city's governing council, depleted by plague deaths, was quickly reconstituted with new members drawn from the merchant community. Trade networks that had been disrupted by the plague were slowly rebuilt, often with new partners and new routes. The city's famous glassmakers, reduced to a handful of survivors, began training new apprentices with an urgency that would have been unthinkable in the leisurely craft traditions of the pre-plague world. The plague had also created new forms of religious expression that reflected the changed circumstances of European life. The elaborate ceremonies and rituals that had characterized medieval Christianity seemed inadequate to address the scale of suffering that communities had experienced. New forms of popular devotion emerged, often emphasizing personal relationships with God rather than the mediation of church hierarchy. The flagellant movements that appeared across Europe in the wake of the plague represented one extreme of this religious transformation. Groups of penitents would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in elaborate ceremonies designed to appease God's wrath and end the plague. These movements, while often condemned by church authorities, reflected a deeper hunger for spiritual responses that matched the intensity of the crisis. But perhaps more significant were the quieter transformations in religious life. The parish priests who had survived the plague often found themselves ministering to communities that had been fundamentally changed by their shared experience of suffering. The careful theological distinctions that had once seemed so important began to matter less than the practical question of how to provide comfort and meaning to people who had lost so much. The economic life of Europe had also been turned upside down by the plague. The careful balance between labor and resources that had characterized medieval society was suddenly disrupted by the massive reduction in population. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations stood empty, not because they were unproductive, but because there was no one left to work them. Workshops that had supplied goods for local and international markets closed their doors, not because there was no demand, but because the craftsmen who had possessed the necessary skills were dead. This disruption created opportunities as well as challenges. The survivors of the plague found themselves in a world where labor was scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who had once been bound to the land could now negotiate for better terms or simply move to communities that offered more attractive conditions. Craftsmen who had once faced fierce competition for apprenticeships and customers now found themselves in high demand, able to command prices that would have been unthinkable in the pre-plague world. The transformation of European society extended even to the most intimate aspects of human life. The careful courtship rituals and marriage customs that had governed family formation for centuries were disrupted by the simple fact that so many potential partners had died. Young people who might have expected to marry within their own communities now found themselves choosing partners from among the survivors of distant villages. The elaborate dowry systems that had once regulated marriage alliances were simplified by the urgent need to form new families and continue the basic work of human reproduction. Perhaps most profoundly, the plague had changed the way Europeans thought about time and the future. The medieval world had been built on the assumption that the patterns of the past would continue indefinitely, that the social structures and cultural traditions that had served previous generations would serve future ones as well. The plague had shattered this assumption, creating a world where change was not only possible, but inevitable. As the survivors of the plague looked around at their transformed world, they were forced to confront fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. What did it mean to be part of a community when that community had been decimated by disease? How should resources be allocated when the traditional systems of inheritance and property had been disrupted? What was the proper relationship between individual survival and collective responsibility? These questions would not be answered quickly or easily. The Europe that emerged from the plague would spend decades, even centuries, working out the implications of the transformation that had begun in those terrible years of 1348 and 1349. But already, in the immediate aftermath of the Great Mortality, new patterns were beginning to emerge that would shape the future of European civilization. The world had indeed been turned upside down, but from this upheaval would come innovations and adaptations that would ultimately contribute to the cultural flowering known as the Renaissance. The plague had destroyed much, but it had also created possibilities that would never have existed in the stable, hierarchical world that had preceded it. In the aftermath of the plague's devastating sweep across Europe, a new form of artistic expression began to appear on the walls of churches, in illuminated manuscripts, and in the popular imagination of the survivors. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, depicted skeleton figures leading people from all walks of life in a macabre procession toward the grave. This haunting imagery captured something essential about the plague experience: the way death had revealed itself as the ultimate equalizer, touching pope and peasant, merchant and monk with the same bony finger. The medieval world had always been highly stratified, with elaborate systems of hierarchy that seemed to reflect the divine order of creation itself. At the top stood the nobility, their bloodlines traced back through generations of warriors and rulers. Below them came the clergy, guardians of spiritual knowledge, and intermediaries between earth and heaven. The merchant classes occupied their own complex hierarchy, from wealthy international traders to local shopkeepers. And at the bottom of the social pyramid were the peasants, tied to the land by bonds of custom and law that had endured for centuries. But the plague recognized none of these careful distinctions. The disease that had swept across Europe showed no respect for blue blood or sacred vows, for accumulated wealth or scholarly learning. In the plague pits that had been dug outside every major city, the bodies of nobles lay mixed with those of their servants, while bishops and beggars shared the same anonymous graves. Picture the scene in a great cathedral during the height of the plague, where the archbishop himself lay dying in the same makeshift infirmary as the poorest beggars from the city streets. The elaborate vestments that had once marked his high office were stained with sweat and blood, while his groans of pain mingled with those of men and women who had never been deemed worthy to speak to him in health. The careful protocols of medieval society, the bowing and scraping that had maintained social distance for centuries, seemed suddenly irrelevant when faced with the democracy of suffering. Yet, even as the plague demonstrated the ultimate equality of death, it also revealed how profoundly social position could still matter in the face of crisis. The wealthy merchant who fell ill in his well-appointed home, surrounded by family and servants, died in very different circumstances from the poor labourer who collapsed in the street with no one to comfort his final moments. The nobleman's daughter, who succumbed to the plague in her father's castle, was mourned and remembered in ways that the peasant girl who died in a hovel could never be. The plague exposed the complex relationship between social privilege and human vulnerability that had always existed in medieval society, but which had been largely hidden by the normal routines of daily life. The castle walls that had protected noble families from human enemies proved useless against microscopic invaders. The monastery walls that had sheltered monks from worldly temptations could not keep out the disease that travelled with the very pilgrims who came seeking spiritual guidance. In the great commercial cities, the plague struck at the heart of the merchant oligarchies that had grown powerful through international trade. The Medici banks that had financed kings and popes found their operations disrupted not by financial crisis, but by the simple fact that key partners and agents were dead. The trading companies that had built their fortunes on reliable networks of trust and communication discovered that their most valuable assets, the relationships that had been built over generations, could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. The response of different social classes to the plague revealed as much about medieval society as the disease itself. The nobility, trained from childhood to view themselves as natural leaders and protectors of their communities, often responded to the plague with a mixture of noblesse oblige and practical self-interest. Some nobles fled their estates, seeking safety in remote castles or foreign lands. Others remained at their posts, organizing relief efforts and trying to maintain order in their territories, even as they watched their own families succumb to the disease. The clergy faced perhaps the most complex challenge of all. As the spiritual guides of medieval society, they were expected to provide comfort and meaning in the face of unprecedented suffering. Yet they were also human beings, as vulnerable to the plague as anyone else, and often more exposed to the disease because of their duty to minister to the sick and dying. The priests who continued to perform last rites for plague victims, knowing that they were risking their own lives, embodied both the best and the most tragic aspects of medieval religious life. The merchant classes, with their long experience of risk and adaptation, often showed remarkable resilience in the face of the plague. They had built their fortunes on the ability to navigate uncertainty, to find opportunities in chaos, and to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Many merchants who survived the plague found themselves in advantageous positions, able to acquire property and goods from families that had been wiped out, or to establish new trading relationships with communities that had lost their traditional commercial partners. For the peasant classes, the plague represented both catastrophe and opportunity. The immediate impact was devastating. Entire villages disappeared, leaving behind only empty houses and abandoned fields. But the survivors often found themselves in a world where labor was scarce and therefore valuable. The careful legal bonds that had tied peasants to their lord's land began to weaken as survivors moved freely between communities, seeking better conditions and higher wages. The plague had also created new forms of social mobility that would have been unimaginable in the pre-plague world. The young peasant who inherited his master's workshop when the plague wiped out an entire family line. The servant who became a merchant when her employer died and left her his goods. the monk who found himself elevated to bishop simply because he was one of the few clergy members who survived. These individual stories of transformation reflected broader changes in the structure of European society. Perhaps most significantly, the plague had begun to change the way people thought about social hierarchy itself. The elaborate justifications for medieval society's rigid class system, that nobles were naturally suited to rule, that peasants were naturally suited to labor, that social position reflected divine will, seemed less convincing when everyone had watched death select its victims with apparent randomness. The artistic representation of the Dance of Death captured this transformation in medieval consciousness. The skeletal figures that led emperors and farmers, merchants and monks in their macabre procession suggested not just the universality of death, but the ultimate meaninglessness of social distinctions. The crown that had seemed so important to the king offered no protection against the grave. The gold that had given the merchant his power could not buy him another day of life. Yet the Dance of Death was not entirely a message of despair. In its recognition of common humanity, in its insistence that all social distinctions were ultimately temporary, there was also a kind of liberation. If death was the great equalizer, then life was the great opportunity, a chance to create meaning and value that transcended the accidents of birth and circumstance. The plague had revealed both the fragility and the resilience of human society. The elaborate structures of medieval civilization had proved vulnerable to a microscopic enemy, but the underlying human capacity for adaptation and renewal had shown itself to be remarkably strong. The survivors who emerged from the plague years would use this knowledge to create new forms of social organization, new ways of thinking about individual worth and collective responsibility. The Dance of Death would remain a powerful image in European art and literature for centuries to come, a reminder of the plague years when the normal order of society had been suspended and humanity had been forced to confront fundamental questions about justice, meaning, and the proper organization of human life. But it was also a testament to the survivors' ability to find beauty and meaning, even in the darkest moments of human experience. The skeletal figures that danced through medieval imagination were not just symbols of death, but symbols of transformation, reminders that even the most devastating challenges could become opportunities for renewal and growth. The world that emerged from the plague would be different from the one that had entered it, but it would also be in many ways more humane, more flexible, and more responsive to individual merit and achievement. In the years to come, the lessons of the Dance of Death would contribute to the intellectual and cultural flowering that would become known as the Renaissance. The plague had destroyed much, but it had also cleared the ground for new growth, new ideas, and new forms of human expression that would transform European civilization in ways that would echo through the centuries. As the plague's devastating grip on Europe began to loosen in the early 1350s, the survivors found themselves inheriting a world that was both emptier and, in many ways, more full of possibilities than the one their parents had known. The immediate crisis of mass mortality had passed, but the work of rebuilding civilization was just beginning. What emerged from this reconstruction would be a society fundamentally different from the medieval world that had existed before the plague's arrival. Walk through any European village in the autumn of 3052, and you would encounter scenes that captured both the devastation and the unexpected opportunities created by the plague. Empty houses stood with their doors wide open, their former inhabitants long dead and buried in the mass graves that marked every community's encounter with the disease. But beside these abandoned dwellings, you might also see new construction, modest buildings erected by survivors who had inherited resources they never could have imagined possessing in the old world. The most immediate and visible change was in the relationship between land and labor. For centuries, Europe had been characterized by a relative scarcity of land and an abundance of workers. Peasants had been tied to their lords' estates, not just by law, but by practical necessity. There was simply nowhere else for them to go. But the plague had inverted this ancient equation. Suddenly, there was land available everywhere, while the living hands needed to work it had become precious and scarce. Picture a young peasant named Thomas, who before the plague had been bound to serve on his lord's manor, with little hope of ever owning property of his own. The plague had taken his lord's family, and most of the other peasants who had worked the estate. Now Thomas found himself in the unprecedented position of being courted by the stewards of multiple manors, each offering better terms than he had ever imagined possible. He could demand higher wages, better living conditions, or even a share of the profits from his labor. The bonds of serfdom that had seemed as permanent as the stones of the church began to weaken under the pressure of economic necessity. This transformation of labor relations was not limited to agriculture. In the towns and cities, the survivors of the plague found themselves in a world where skilled craftsmen commanded unprecedented respect and compensation. The young apprentice, who had expected to spend years learning his trade under strict supervision, now found himself elevated to journeyman status simply because there was no one else available to do the work. The widow, who had inherited her husband's workshop, discovered that she could run the business herself, making decisions and earning profits that would have been unthinkable for a woman in the pre-plague world. The guild systems that had regulated urban crafts for centuries were forced to adapt to these new realities. The careful restrictions on membership, the elaborate apprenticeship requirements, the complex hierarchies of masters and journeymen, all of these traditional structures had to be relaxed or abandoned entirely when survival depended on getting work done rather than maintaining ancient privileges. New guilds were formed, old ones merged, and the entire system of urban craft production was reorganized around the practical needs of communities that had been decimated by disease. The plague had also created new opportunities for geographic mobility that challenged the settled patterns of medieval life. The concept of being rooted in a particular community, which had been fundamental to medieval society, began to break down as survivors moved freely between towns and regions, seeking better opportunities or simply following friends and family members who had scattered during the plague years. The roads that had once carried merchants and pilgrims now carried a new kind of traveler plague survivors, seeking new homes and new lives in a world that had been emptied of many of its previous inhabitants. This mobility was particularly pronounced among young people, who found themselves freed from the traditional expectations and obligations that had once governed their life choices. The son of a peasant family might now have the opportunity to learn a trade in a distant city, while the daughter of a merchant family might find herself managing properties in a region where her family had never had interests before. The plague had disrupted the normal patterns of inheritance and expectation, creating a generation of young adults who had to invent their own futures. The economic transformation extended to the most basic aspects of daily life. The survivors of the plague found themselves living in a world where labor was scarce and therefore valuable, but where land and physical goods were abundant and therefore cheap. A craftsman who had once struggled to afford a modest dwelling might now find himself able to purchase a substantial house that had been abandoned by a family wiped out by the plague. A farmer who had once worked a tiny plot of marginal land might now have access to some of the most fertile fields in his region. This inversion of traditional economic relationships had profound psychological effects on the survivors. The scarcity mindset that had characterized medieval life, the assumption that resources were limited and that one person's gain necessarily meant another's loss, began to give way to a more optimistic view of human possibilities. The plague had demonstrated that dramatic change was possible, that the social structures that had seemed so permanent could be transformed almost overnight. The transformation was particularly visible in the realm of education and knowledge. The universities that had been centers of medieval learning found themselves struggling to maintain their traditional programs when so many of their faculty and students had died. But this crisis also created opportunities for innovation and reform. New subjects were introduced, new teaching methods were developed, and new kinds of students, including more women and people from lower social classes, gained access to educational opportunities that had previously been restricted to a narrow elite. The plague had also changed the way people thought about time and planning. The medieval world had been built on the assumption that the patterns of the past would continue indefinitely, that careful long-term planning was both possible and necessary. But the plague had demonstrated that even the most carefully laid plans could be disrupted by unpredictable events. The survivors developed a more flexible approach to life, one that emphasized adaptation and opportunism over rigid adherence to tradition. Religious life, too, was transformed by the plague experience. The elaborate hierarchies and ceremonial practices that had characterized medieval Christianity seemed less relevant to people who had witnessed the apparent randomness of death and survival. New forms of personal devotion emerged, often emphasizing individual relationships with God rather than the mediation of church institutions. The religious communities that survived the plague were often more egalitarian and more focused on practical service than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague had created new forms of community solidarity that transcended traditional social boundaries. The shared experience of surviving unprecedented catastrophe had bonded people together in ways that cut across the old divisions of class, occupation, and geographic origin. The neighbors who had helped each other through the plague years often maintained these relationships long after the immediate crisis had passed, creating new networks of mutual support that were based on shared experience rather than traditional social position. Perhaps most significantly, the plague had begun to change the way Europeans thought about individual worth and potential. The medieval world had been built on the assumption that social position was largely determined by birth, and that most people would live and die in the same circumstances as their parents. But the plague had demonstrated that individual capability and determination could triumph over traditional limitations. The survivors who had rebuilt their lives from nothing became living proof that human potential was not fixed by the circumstances of birth. The world that emerged from the plague years was one in which innovation and adaptation were not just possible, but necessary. The survivors had learned that the old ways of doing things might not be adequate to meet new challenges, that flexibility and creativity were more valuable than rigid adherence to tradition. This transformation of mindset would prove to be one of the most important legacies of the plague years, contributing to the intellectual and cultural flowering that would become known as the Renaissance. As the 1350s progressed, the survivors of the plague continued to work out the implications of their transformed world. The immediate crisis had passed, but the long-term consequences of the plague would continue to shape European civilization for generations to come. The world that emerged from the ashes of the medieval order would be more dynamic, more individualistic, and more open to change than anything that had come before. The plague that had swept across Europe in the middle of the 14th century cast a shadow that would extend far beyond the immediate years of crisis, shaping the development of European civilization in ways that would echo through the centuries. Like a stone thrown into still water, the plague's impact created ripples that spread outward through time, touching aspects of human life and culture that seemed far removed from the immediate experience of disease and death. In the decades following the plague's retreat, European artists began to develop new ways of representing death and mortality that reflected the profound psychological impact of the plague years. The medieval art that had preceded the plague had often portrayed death as a distant, abstract concept, a theological idea rather than a lived reality. But the artists who had survived the plague years had seen death up close, had watched it select its victims with apparent randomness, and this experience transformed their understanding of what it meant to be human. The artistic movement known as the memento mori tradition, literally remember death, became a dominant theme in European art for centuries after the plague. Paintings that had once focused on the glory of religious or secular subjects now included subtle reminders of mortality, skulls hidden in the corners of portraits, hourglasses marking the passage of time, flowers that had begun to wilt even in the moment of their greatest beauty. These images served as constant reminders that the apparent security of daily life was fundamentally fragile, that the plague had revealed truths about human existence that could never be forgotten. The architectural legacy of the plague years was equally profound. The churches and public buildings constructed in the aftermath of the plague often reflected a changed understanding of the relationship between individual and community, between earthly achievement and eternal destiny. The soaring Gothic cathedrals that had dominated pre-plague architecture gave way to more human-scaled buildings that emphasized comfort and practicality over pure spiritual aspiration. The plague had taught Europeans that heaven was important, but that life on earth deserved attention and care as well. Perhaps most significantly, the plague had fundamentally altered the demographic structure of European society in ways that would influence political and economic development for centuries. The massive population decline had created a labor shortage that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. This scarcity of workers continued to drive wages upward and to erode the traditional bonds of serfdom, contributing to the gradual transformation of European society from a feudal to a more modern economic system. The political implications of these demographic changes were equally profound. The traditional feudal system had been based on the assumption that land was the primary source of wealth, and that large populations of agricultural workers were necessary to generate that wealth. But the plague had demonstrated that smaller populations could actually be more prosperous if they had access to better technology and more efficient forms of organization. This realization would contribute to the development of more centralized nation-states that could mobilize resources more effectively than the fragmented feudal lordships of the medieval period. The plague had also created new forms of international consciousness that would shape European development for centuries. The disease had demonstrated that events in distant lands could have immediate and devastating consequences for local communities. The merchants who had carried the plague from Asian ports to European cities had shown that the medieval world was far more interconnected than most people had realized. This awareness of global connectivity would contribute to the age of exploration and the development of truly worldwide trade networks. The intellectual legacy of the plague years was perhaps even more important than its immediate political and economic effects. The scholars and thinkers who had survived the plague had been forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of human knowledge and the reliability of traditional authorities. The classical texts that had provided the foundation for medieval learning had offered little guidance for dealing with an unprecedented pandemic. This failure of traditional knowledge systems encouraged a more experimental and empirical approach to understanding the natural world. The medical advances that emerged from the plague experience would prove to be particularly significant. The physicians who had struggled to treat plague victims had been forced to abandon many of their traditional theories and to develop new approaches based on careful observation and practical experience. The plague had taught them that diseases could be contagious, that they could spread through communities in predictable patterns, and that prevention might be more effective than treatment. These insights would contribute to the development of modern public health practices and to a more scientific approach to medicine. The plague had also contributed to the development of new forms of record-keeping and administration that would prove essential to the growth of modern government. The need to track mortality rates, to manage mass graves, and to redistribute property from plague victims had forced medieval authorities to develop more sophisticated systems of documentation and bureaucracy. These administrative innovations would prove to be crucial to the development of more effective and centralized forms of government. The religious and philosophical implications of the plague experience continued to influence European thought long after the immediate crisis had passed. The apparent randomness of plague mortality had challenged traditional assumptions about divine justice and the relationship between virtue and reward. The theological debates that emerged from the plague years would contribute to the development of new forms of religious thought that emphasized personal faith and individual responsibility rather than institutional authority. The plague had also created new forms of social organization that would prove to be more flexible and adaptive than the rigid hierarchies of medieval society. The communities that had survived the plague had often been forced to develop new forms of mutual support and cooperation that transcended traditional social boundaries. These innovations in social organization would contribute to the development of more democratic and egalitarian forms of government and civil society. Perhaps most importantly, the plague had changed the way Europeans thought about time and change. The medieval world had been built on the assumption that the patterns of the past would continue indefinitely, that social structures and cultural traditions were essentially permanent. But the plague had demonstrated that even the most fundamental aspects of human society could be transformed almost overnight. This recognition of the possibility of rapid change would contribute to the intellectual and cultural dynamism that would characterize the Renaissance and the early modern period. The economic innovations that emerged from the plague years would also have long-term consequences for European development. The survivors of the plague had been forced to develop new forms of banking, insurance, and commercial organization to deal with the disruptions caused by mass mortality. These financial innovations would prove to be crucial to the development of modern capitalism and to the financing of the great voyages of exploration that would connect Europe to the Americas and Asia. The plague had also contributed to the development of new forms of artistic and literary expression that would influence European culture for centuries. The writers and artists who had survived the plague years had been forced to find new ways to express the complexity of human experience in the face of unprecedented suffering. The literary works that emerged from this period, from Boccaccio's Decameron to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, would establish new standards for artistic achievement and would influence the development of European literature for generations. As the 15th century progressed, the long-term consequences of the plague continued to unfold. The demographic, economic, and cultural changes that had been set in motion by the plague would contribute to the intellectual flowering of the Renaissance, the geographical expansion of the Age of Exploration, and the political transformation that would lead to the modern European state system. The plague had not just been a temporary crisis, but a fundamental turning point in the development of European civilization. The shadow cast by the plague would continue to influence European development well into the modern period, shaping everything from artistic expression to political organization to economic theory. The Europe that emerged from the plague years would be more dynamic, more innovative, and more open to change than the medieval world that had preceded it. The plague had destroyed much, but it had also created the conditions for unprecedented growth and achievement. The artistic and literary traditions that emerged from the plague experience created a new aesthetic vocabulary that would define European culture for centuries. The memento mori tradition, the artistic reminder of mortality, became a dominant theme in European art, appearing in everything from illuminated manuscripts to cathedral sculptures. These works served not merely as decoration, but as profound meditations on the meaning of life and death, encouraging viewers to contemplate their own mortality, while paradoxically affirming the value of human existence. The literary tradition that grew from the plague years produced some of Europe's most enduring works of art. The Canterbury Tales, with its diverse cast of pilgrims travelling together despite their different social stations, reflected the more fluid social relationships that had emerged from the plague experience. The works of Petrarch and Boccaccio, with their emphasis on individual human experience and emotion, marked a fundamental shift from the more collective and institutional focus of earlier medieval literature. These writers had learned to value personal experience over abstract authority, individual perspective over collective doctrine. The musical traditions that developed during and after the Plague Years also reflected the transformed consciousness of European society. The emergence of polyphonic music, with its complex interweaving of multiple melodic lines, seemed to mirror the more complex social relationships that had emerged from the plague experience. The popularity of secular songs and instrumental music reflected a culture that had learned to value immediate human experience and pleasure alongside spiritual preparation for the afterlife. The plague experience had also contributed to the development of new forms of historical consciousness that would influence European thought for generations. The chroniclers who had recorded the plague years had learned to value eyewitness testimony over traditional authorities, detailed observation over conventional wisdom. This more empirical approach to understanding the past would prove to be crucial to the development of modern historical scholarship. The educational institutions that emerged from the plague years reflected the changed priorities of European society. The universities that had survived the pandemic had been forced to develop new curricula that emphasized practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. The scholars who had lived through the plague years had learned to value adaptability over rigid adherence to tradition, creative problem solving over mechanical application of established principles. The plague experience had also left its mark on European attitudes toward death and dying in ways that would persist for centuries. The communities that had survived the pandemic had developed new rituals and practices for dealing with mortality that emphasized both individual dignity and collective support. The art of dying well, the ars moriendi, became a central concern of European culture, reflecting a society that had learned to live with the constant possibility of death while maintaining hope for the future. The technological innovations that had emerged from the plague years continued to influence European development long after the immediate crisis had passed. The improvements in agricultural techniques that had been developed to cope with reduced populations contributed to the gradual increase in European food production. The innovations in manufacturing that had been developed to deal with labor shortages contributed to the development of more efficient production methods. The improvements in transportation and communication that had been developed to deal with the disruptions caused by mass mortality contributed to the development of more integrated regional and international markets. The plague experience had also contributed to the development of new forms of social organization that would influence European development for centuries. The mutual aid societies that had been formed to deal with the immediate crisis evolved into permanent institutions that provided support for the sick, the elderly, and the poor. The neighborhood organizations that had been developed to maintain community life during the pandemic became models for later forms of local government and civic organization. The resonances between the medieval plague experience and contemporary challenges reveal the enduring patterns of human response to unprecedented change, creating mirrors that reflect both our vulnerabilities and our remarkable capacity for adaptation across the centuries. When we examine how 14th century communities responded to the Black Death, we discover not merely historical curiosities, but profound insights into the fundamental nature of human resilience and the mechanisms through which societies transform themselves in the face of existential crisis. The medieval world's initial response to the plague, a mixture of denial, blame, and desperate attempts to maintain normalcy, echoes remarkably in contemporary reactions to global challenges. Just as medieval authorities initially dismissed early reports of plague as exaggeration or divine punishment for distant communities, modern societies often struggle to acknowledge the reality of global threats until they arrive at their own doorstep. The human tendency to assume that catastrophe will remain distant and manageable reflects a psychological defense mechanism that transcends historical periods. The scapegoating and persecution that characterized some medieval responses to the plague find disturbing parallels in contemporary reactions to global crises. The medieval tendency to blame marginalized communities for the pandemic reflects the same human impulse to find simple explanations for complex problems that we observe in modern times. Yet the medieval experience also demonstrates how communities can learn to move beyond blame toward more constructive responses, offering hope that contemporary societies might follow similar paths toward greater understanding and cooperation. The medieval innovations in community care and mutual support that emerged from the plague years provide compelling models for contemporary challenges. The neighborhood organizations that developed to care for the sick and maintain community life demonstrate how crisis can strengthen social bonds and create new forms of solidarity. The mutual aid societies that emerged from the plague experience show how communities can develop sustainable systems of support that outlast the immediate crisis and contribute to long-term resilience. The economic transformations that followed the medieval plague offer insights into how societies can adapt to demographic and economic disruption. The labor shortages that resulted from the pandemic created opportunities for social mobility and wage increases that ultimately contributed to the decline of feudalism and the emergence of more modern economic relationships. Similarly, contemporary demographic changes and economic disruptions might create opportunities for positive social transformation if societies can learn to adapt existing institutions and create new forms of economic organization. The medieval experience also demonstrates the importance of maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to new circumstances. The communities that survived the plague most successfully were those that managed to preserve their essential values and traditions while adapting their practices to new realities. This balance between continuity and change provides a model for contemporary societies facing rapid transformation, showing how communities can maintain their identity while embracing necessary adaptations. The plague experience also reveals the crucial role of local knowledge and community-based solutions in addressing global challenges. The medieval communities that responded most effectively to the pandemic were those that developed local innovations based on their specific circumstances and needs. This emphasis on local adaptation and community-based solutions offers valuable insights for contemporary approaches to global challenges that require coordinated responses but must be implemented at the local level. The medieval development of new forms of scientific and medical knowledge in response to the plague provides models for contemporary innovation in the face of unprecedented challenges. The physicians and scholars who survived the plague years learned to value observation over theory, practical experience over abstract speculation. This more empirical approach to understanding the world contributed to the scientific revolution and offers insights into how contemporary societies might approach complex problems that require new forms of knowledge and understanding. The plague experience also demonstrates the importance of maintaining hope and meaning in the face of overwhelming challenges. The medieval communities that survived the pandemic were those that managed to find new sources of meaning and purpose in the transformed world. The artistic and literary traditions that emerged from the plague years show how human creativity can flourish even in the most difficult circumstances, offering inspiration for contemporary efforts to maintain cultural vitality in the face of global challenges. The medieval experience of rebuilding communities and institutions after the plague provides models for contemporary recovery and renewal. The urban planners who rebuilt plague devastated cities often incorporated lessons learned during the pandemic, creating more livable and resilient communities. The institutional innovations that emerged from the plague years, from improved public health systems to new forms of economic organization, demonstrate how crisis can catalyze positive change that benefits future generations. The plague experience also reveals the importance of international cooperation and knowledge sharing in addressing global challenges. The medieval world's initial fragmentation and competition hindered effective responses to the pandemic, while the communities that shared knowledge and resources were more successful in managing the crisis. This lesson remains relevant for contemporary efforts to address global challenges that require coordinated international responses. The Black Death represents not merely a historical catastrophe, but a profound manifestation of the eternal cycles of challenge and renewal that have shaped human civilization since its earliest beginnings. When we place the plague experience within the broader context of human history, we discover that it exemplifies the fundamental patterns through which societies face the unknown, adapt to unprecedented change, and ultimately find new sources of meaning and purpose that enable not merely survival, but transformation and growth. Throughout human history, communities have faced moments when their familiar world seems to dissolve, when established institutions fail, and when the future appears uncertain and threatening. The plague experience demonstrates how these moments of crisis, despite their immediate devastation, often become catalysts for positive change that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The medieval world that emerged from the plague years was not simply a damaged version of what had come before, but a fundamentally transformed civilization that incorporated new values, new institutions, and new possibilities for human flourishing. The cyclical nature of human experience reveals itself in the ways that each generation faces challenges that seem unprecedented, but actually reflect deeper patterns of growth and adaptation. The medieval response to the plague, the initial shock, the gradual adaptation, the eventual transformation, mirrors the responses we observe in communities facing natural disasters, economic disruption, or social upheaval throughout history. These patterns suggest that the human capacity for resilience and renewal is not merely a modern achievement, but a fundamental characteristic of our species that transcends historical periods and cultural boundaries. The plague experience also demonstrates how individual and collective responses to crisis can create new possibilities for human development. The medieval world's emphasis on individual worth and social mobility that emerged from the plague years reflects a universal human tendency to use crisis as an opportunity for personal and social transformation. The stories of peasants who became landowners, craftsmen who founded guilds, and communities that developed new forms of governance show how crisis can reveal hidden potentials and create new pathways for human achievement. The spiritual and philosophical responses to the plague also reflect eternal human concerns about meaning, mortality, and purpose. The medieval world's development of new forms of religious expression, artistic creation, and philosophical inquiry in response to the plague demonstrates how human creativity can flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The emphasis on personal spiritual experience over institutional authority that emerged from the plague years reflects a pattern we observe throughout history, where crisis leads to more authentic and individualized forms of meaning making. The plague experience reveals how technological and social innovations often emerge from the pressure of necessity during times of crisis. The medieval world's development of new agricultural techniques, manufacturing methods, and urban planning approaches in response to the plague demonstrates how human ingenuity finds expression when traditional solutions prove inadequate. This pattern of innovation through necessity appears throughout human history, suggesting that crisis and creativity are intimately connected in the human experience. The long-term consequences of the plague also demonstrate how temporary disruptions can create permanent positive changes that benefit future generations. The medieval world's development of improved public health systems, more democratic institutions, and more efficient economic organizations in response to the plague shows how crisis can catalyze progress that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. This pattern suggests that even the most challenging experiences can contribute to the long-term flourishing of human civilization. The plague experience also reveals the importance of community and mutual support in helping people navigate times of unprecedented change. The medieval world's development of new forms of neighborhood organization, mutual aid societies, and community care demonstrates how crisis can strengthen social bonds and create new forms of solidarity. These innovations reflect eternal human needs for connection and support that find expression in every generation, adapted to the specific circumstances and challenges of their time. The artistic and cultural legacy of the plague years also reflects eternal human needs to find meaning and beauty, even in the midst of suffering. The medieval world's development of new forms of literature, music, and visual art in response to the plague demonstrates how human creativity can transform even the most difficult experiences into sources of inspiration and insight. This pattern of artistic response to crisis appears throughout human history, suggesting that the creation of beauty and meaning is a fundamental human response to challenge and change. The plague experience ultimately demonstrates that human civilization is not a fragile construction that can be easily destroyed, but a resilient and adaptive system that can survive even the most severe challenges while incorporating lessons learned from crisis into its ongoing development. The medieval world's transformation in response to the plague shows how human societies can use even devastating experiences as opportunities for growth, renewal, and positive change. As we reach the end of this long journey through the story of the Black Death, we find ourselves not in a place of despair, but in a space of profound understanding about the remarkable resilience of human civilization and the eternal capacity for renewal that characterizes our species. The plague experience, despite its immediate devastation, ultimately became a catalyst for positive transformation that contributed to the Renaissance, the development of modern medicine, and the emergence of more democratic and equitable forms of social organization. The medieval world that survived the plague learned lessons that continue to guide us today, that communities are strongest when they care for their most vulnerable members, that innovation often emerges from necessity, and that human creativity can flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The survivors of the plague discovered that individual worth is not determined by social circumstances, that traditional authorities are not infallible, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary achievements when circumstances require adaptation and growth. The story of the Black Death reminds us that even the most devastating challenges in human history ultimately contribute to the ongoing story of human development and progress. The plague experience shows us that societies can survive unprecedented disruption, that communities can adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their essential values, and that crisis can reveal hidden strengths and possibilities that lead to positive transformation. For contemporary listeners facing their own challenges and uncertainties, the plague experience offers both perspective and hope. The medieval world's successful adaptation to unprecedented change demonstrates that human communities have always found ways to survive and thrive despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The innovations in community care, economic organization, and cultural expression that emerged from the plague years show how crisis can become a source of creativity and positive change. The plague experience also reminds us that we are part of a continuous story of human adaptation and growth that connects us to all previous generations and extends into the future. The medieval communities that survived the plague were not fundamentally different from us. They faced uncertainty with courage, adapted to change with creativity, and found meaning in their experiences through connection with others and commitment to shared values. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the knowledge that human civilization has weathered countless storms and emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more creative as a result. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human communities find ways to care for one another, to adapt to new circumstances, and to create beauty and meaning from the raw materials of their experience. The medieval world's journey through the plague years shows us that we, too, possess the resilience, creativity, and capacity for mutual support that enable not merely survival, but transformation and growth. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that you are part of this continuing story of human adaptation and renewal, and that tomorrow offers new opportunities for connection, creativity, and positive change.